This story isn't mine, but something that happened to somebody that I was classmates with. Some of the details mentioned below I received from her friends, and some were from an interview she gave to a local daily. This incident happened a few years ago when I was in college pursuing my master's degree. There was this group of friends, 3 boys and a girl, and they were quite close. We actually had a common class in the previous semester, and that's how I knew them. I don't think I ever talked to the guys, but the girl, I'll call her Lizzie, seemed quite friendly, and we did exchange smiles occasionally. On this particular day, after the classes at about 5 in the evening, the group drove their car to the nearby store. This store was about a 5-minute drive from the college. There was also a cafe nearby, and a food truck too, so it was a common hangout for college kids. The boy who was driving parked the car on the road, and the boys got out to grab something quickly. Lizzie, for some reason, chose not to get out of the car, maybe because the boys made it clear that they were going to make the trip quick. Lizzie just sat in the back seat, scrolling her phone. She was quite oblivious to her surroundings, focusing on the phone, when all of a sudden, she heard the car's engine start and then slowly move forward. She looked ahead, and to her surprise, it wasn't her friend who was driving. It was a complete stranger. That's when she started to panic and screamed her lungs out. Her friends and other people noticed, so they too started screaming for the man to stop the car. One of Lizzie's friends even chased after them, but the driver just increased the speed and began driving recklessly on the highway. Lizzie tried to open the doors and windows, but the guy had instantly locked them as soon as he entered, so she tried kicking the seat and hitting him, but he just pushed her to the back. He was a 6-foot-tall, well-built guy. She then realized that she had her phone in her hands, so she quickly tried calling the police, but he snatched her phone from her. She might have tried screaming and even begging for him to let her out, but he didn't. When they entered a secluded road, she had kind of lost hope of getting out alive, so she just closed her eyes and began praying to God for help. Just then, as if God answered her prayers, she saw flashing lights behind her, tailing the car. The man tried to drive faster to lose them, but the patrol vehicle managed to overtake the car and bring them to a halt. As soon as the car came to a stop, the driver tried running away, but he was caught. The police helped Lizzie out of the car. She was in shock and trembling with fear. She didn't know what evil intentions this man had for trying to kidnap her. Fortunately, while they were on the highway speeding away, a traffic cop had seen the car driving recklessly and noticed a woman inside hitting the window. He had a gut feeling that there was somebody in trouble, so he quickly called a patrol vehicle in the vicinity to tail the car. That quick action saved Lizzie. As for how the car was stolen, Lizzie's friend who drove had forgotten to lock the car's door and also remove the keys. Maybe they thought it would be quick. The police interrogated the man, and he said he didn't realize that there was somebody in the back seat, due to Lizzie sitting behind the driver's seat, and his initial plan was to steal the car, but when he saw that there was a girl in the back, he wanted to desert it in a secluded place. This is hard to believe, but that was his version, and I don't know if he was lying or later confessed the truth. But surely, he didn't plan to just leave her in a secluded place. If he planned to let her out, then he might have done that beforehand. Fortunately, she was saved, but the fact that she was kidnapped in daylight at a public spot is just shocking. One of my friends was also at that spot when this incident occurred. Everyone seemed shocked and in distress. The trauma of escaping her kidnapping had kind of taken a toll on Lizzie, who I never saw after this incident. I got to know from her classmates that she decided to go back to her hometown and only come back for the exams. The boys did stick around, but they definitely weren't their usual selves like before. Before this, they were always cracking jokes and laughing hysterically. Afterwards, they often seemed quiet and distant, like they missed their friend and kind of blamed themselves for it. We never got to know what happened to the man, but I read an article in the newspaper covering the story. It said that he had been arrested previously for stealing things and also for robbing a house, so when he saw the new car, he must have decided to steal it. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but it could have been worse if the guy hadn't been arrested. This incident did teach me that really weird and terrifying things may happen to normal people we know, or even to us, which might transform our ordinary day into something of a nightmare. So let's just be cautious of our surroundings, and definitely be safe. After my first marriage ended, I was alone for a while. I moved back to my hometown and got a 1-bedroom apartment in my old neighborhood. My parents were only 15 minutes away, and I was able to reconnect with some of my old friends. After about a year of that, I was ready to start dating again. That was when I started to get into online dating. I had a few alright meetups during the first 6 months or so, but then one night, I matched with a woman named Karen. She was a few years younger than me. I was 32, and I think she was 28. She had dark hair and wore glasses. She was pretty, but also demure. She didn't fully smile in any of her pictures, and I got the idea she was quiet just by looking at her pictures. We chatted for a bit, and then decided to meet up for drinks. I took an Uber to the bar and grabbed a table off to the side, then texted her. I sat there kind of nervous for a while, but she arrived within only a few minutes, and she looked just like her pictures. She was nice enough at first, but I would be lying if I said I saw any future with her. I was thinking that we would just have a few drinks, and then call it a night. After a while, though, I was a little drunk and feeling brave. It was getting late, and I decided to take a chance and ask her, "Would you like to come to my place?" Karen smiled and shook her head. "No, but you can come over to my house if you want," she offered. I was surprised, but agreed to go. I paid the bill, and we left the bar. I thought we were going to take an Uber, but then Karen told me that she had a car. There was a parking lot down the street, so we walked there. Her car was actually a pickup truck that looked out of place for a girl like her. I got in anyway, and she started driving. I still didn't even know where we were going specifically. After about half an hour, I noticed we were out in the country. I started to feel uneasy, and I asked her, "Where do you live?" She replied, "It's just a little farther." We were still talking and having a good time, but we were really out in the middle of nowhere. I had no idea how I was going to get home, because an Uber would be so expensive. Finally, we arrived at an old house in an isolated spot. As we pulled into the long driveway, I got a closer look at the place. It looked run down, but I saw lights on inside. She told me she lived alone, so I figured she left the lights on for whatever reason. For a split second, though, I thought I saw somebody walk by one of the windows, but it was so fast that I wasn't sure. I asked Karen if there was anybody else there, but she told me no. I actually believed her. When the car stopped out front, Karen smiled at me and said, "We're here." We got out of the car and started walking towards the house. As we made our way up the path, I noticed how weird the whole thing was. I had just met this person online, and there I was in this remote spot with her. She was basically a perfect stranger, and I hardly knew her. Like I said earlier, I was a bit tipsy from the drinks, so maybe not thinking straight. The place looked neglected, almost abandoned, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. It didn't seem like the kind of place where a cute young woman would live by herself. But Karen seemed unfazed, leading the way confidently. I followed her. When we reached the front door, she stopped, opened it, and gestured for me to enter. I hesitated, but told myself I was overreacting. Inside, the lights were already on, and it smelled musty. I glanced around expecting to see somebody, but the place seemed empty. Karen took off her shoes, and as soon as we got in, she disappeared down the hall. I was left standing in the doorway. As each minute went by, I was feeling more and more uncomfortable. I had ignored a lot of red flags leading up to this point, and I was really uncomfortable with where I was. I decided to leave right away. Without saying anything, I turned around and walked out the front door. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard footsteps from the house. The scariest part was that it sounded like more than one person. Then Karen called after me. She sounded frantic and also angry, but I kept moving. At that point, I was really glad that I decided to get out of there. I still didn't know what was going on, but it seemed like some kind of setup, and I was pretty sure somebody else was in that house. I found a tree just off the driveway and hid behind it. From my hiding spot, I looked back at the house, and I watched as Karen and a man came out onto the porch. They flicked on the outdoor lights, and I could tell that he was huge. He was a man at least 6'4", with long shoulder-length hair and a beard. The guy looked like a linebacker or something, and he seemed strong. They stepped down away from the house, walked around for a while. The whole time I was praying that they wouldn't check where I was. I was protected by darkness though, so I knew I wouldn't be that easy to find. And there were other trees and bushes around, so I knew it was not going to be that obvious where I was. Once I thought they were gone, I slipped out through the trees to the main road. On my way, I checked my phone and saw that I did have service. I contemplated calling the cops, but I was kind of embarrassed. That, and there wasn't really anything actually illegal that happened. Not that they couldn't deny it anyway if there was. I called for a ride instead. As I waited for the Uber, I kept glancing back towards the house. I was scared that they were going to come after me. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, I saw the headlights of the Uber approaching. I waved the car down as it got close, It stopped, and I got in. The driver was a middle-aged guy who seemed alright. If anything, I was probably the creepy one. I was visibly shaking and must have looked insane. He looked at me curiously, but didn't ask any questions. When I saw myself in the rearview mirror, I noticed that I had a few leaves in my hair. He must have thought I was crazy. I was really glad to be in that car, though, and I really felt like I dodged a bullet. Part of me felt foolish for getting into such a situation, but I made the right call getting out before it was too late. When I think back on that night, I still can't explain what they were up to. Maybe they were just a couple who were into some kinky stuff. That wouldn't explain why she would lie and say that it was just her, though. There are a lot of guys out there who would have been into something like that, so she could have just asked. I don't know why they would trick me into it. Maybe they were going to hurt me, though, and if that were the case, it would all make sense. When I was in high school, I worked at a Subway store, and it was a 45-minute bike ride from my house. I lived kind of out in the country, and there was nowhere that would hire me anywhere closer than that. I didn't have a car, and my parents couldn't always drive me, so biking was my only option. I usually worked the late shift, often getting off after 11 p.m. when I closed the store. The roads around there were narrow, with just a single lane each way. They were so narrow, in fact, that you would sometimes have to go off onto the shoulder when a car was coming in the other direction, especially if it was a truck or a wider car. Since I was a cyclist, it was sometimes pretty scary when a car would pass, because they would get close. One night after a long shift, I locked up and started my bike ride home. It was dark, and the road didn't have a bike path for most of the way, so I had to ride on the shoulder. The air was cool, and it was not very busy. I listened to music while biking, because it was so boring. The late-night streets were always empty, though, so I thought it was okay. I know it sounds dangerous, because you should always be able to hear. When I was about halfway home, I noticed headlights approaching me from behind. The vehicle was moving fast, and I hoped it would pass quickly. The lights were blindingly bright. I wasn't sure if he had his brights on, or if they were just strong lights. It got close, and then instead of passing, it slowed down and started honking at me. I swerved to the side to let it pass, but to my surprise, the car swerved too and stayed behind me. It didn't stop honking. It seemed like they were trying to scare me, or worse. I didn't have many options. The road was narrow, and there was no safe place to pull over. I pulled one of my earphones out, and then turned around again to see the car, which was actually a large SUV. It was right there, almost bumping into my back tire. Then I saw it veer into the middle of the road and speed up. The passenger side window was down, and I saw a man lean out. He was holding something in his hand, and I think it was a weapon. Probably a baseball bat or a pipe, but it also could have been a gun. I decided to make a quick move, and veered off the road onto the shoulder, which was rough gravel. I was just trying to get away from him. My bike wobbled, and I lost control and then crashed down into the ditch. It went over my handlebars, and even scraped my head on the gravel. Luckily, I was wearing a helmet. I might have gotten really hurt otherwise. As I lay there catching my breath, I heard the SUV come to a stop on the road above. I looked up and saw two guys get out. They looked to be around my age, or maybe a few years older. I thought they were probably high school age, but didn't recognize them from my school, even though they were well lit by the car's light. Under any other circumstances, I would have been happy that there was somebody there to help, but they just ran me off the road, and I was pretty sure they weren't friendly. I knew I had to hide, so I crawled over a ridge that was just past the shoulder. I was in the darkness, so I was hoping they couldn't see me. And I stayed there as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The two guys started walking around on the shoulder while I peeked through the grass. I could see them walking around with their lights out, obviously looking for me. "Where'd he go?" one of them said, sounding frustrated. They walked closer to where I was hiding, and I could hear their footsteps on the gravel. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was afraid they might hear it. One of them stepped right over my bike, and I saw one of them nudge it with his foot. Maybe he ran off, the other guy said after a while. They stood there for what felt like forever, with their flashlights sweeping over the ditch and the surrounding area. I stayed hidden, hoping they would give up soon. Finally, they seemed to lose interest and walked back towards their SUV. I watched as they got in and drove away. As the SUV's taillights disappeared into the distance, I could see that the license plate was covered. Once I was sure they were gone, I crawled out from my hiding spot. That was probably at least 10 minutes later. Without the car there, it was pretty dark, but I still managed to find my bike. The front wheel was bent, making it impossible to ride. There was no choice for me but to walk my bike, so I started the long trek home. It would probably be at least an hour on foot. As I walked, I was worried that the SUV would return, but fortunately they never came back. After about half an hour, a car finally passed me. Up until then, the road was completely deserted. I didn't wave it down or anything, but it stopped anyway. I would have been happy to just keep walking. It was a single guy in the driver's seat, and he was about 40 years old. "Everything okay?" he asked, eyeing my damaged bike. "Not really," I replied. Then I briefly explained what happened. I told him I wiped out on the road, but I left out the part with the SUV. I just didn't want to get into it. I told the guy my dad's number, and he called my parents. My dad said that he would come and pick me up, so I waited at the side of the road. The guy stayed with me. That was the first time I realized how badly my leg hurt. There was a scrape down the side, but I also had a bad gash on my elbow. My dad arrived about 20 minutes later, and he pulled up in our old station wagon, looking concerned. We loaded my damaged bike into the back, and I got into the passenger seat. As we drove home, I told him everything that happened in more detail. I wasn't crying, but I was quite upset. When I told my dad that I didn't want to call the cops, he said that we had to. I pushed back a little bit, but eventually gave in to him. He was right after all. The next morning, we called the police, and although we filed a report, the SUV was never found. I thought I saw it a few times on the roads, but I'm not sure, and I was never attacked again. One Friday night, my friends and I decided to go out for some drinks. We picked a bar downtown, a place we'd been a few times before. It was not too crowded, just enough people to keep the atmosphere lively. We found a table near the back and settled in. It was kind of a private section in the bar that was up a few stairs. There was a small railing around it, so it was really like our own little area. We began talking right away, and then ordered a round of beers. There were 5 of us in total, and it was just an ordinary night, nothing special at first. We were joking around and talking about work. We had a view of the bar from our table, and there were a few single guys sitting there drinking. I noticed them, but didn't pay much attention other than that. After a while, some drunk guy stumbled over to our table from the bar. He looked like he'd had one too many, and he was slurring his words badly. He tried talking to my friend Kieran, who was sitting at the end of our table. At first, he tried to ignore him, hoping he'd just go away, but he didn't. I could see him whispering in my friend's ear, but Kieran was leaning away, trying to get away from the guy. I stood up and told the guy to F off, but he only got more aggressive. The bartender noticed and came over to help. He told the guy that he'd had enough, and then offered to call him a cab. He handled the guy well, and managed to get him away from us. I watched as he was escorted out the front door of the bar. We laughed about it after that, and then went back to what we were doing. It was still only around 10, so we ordered another round. By around midnight, I decided to step out for a smoke. I was the only smoker among us, so they all stayed at the table. I told my friends I'd be back in a few minutes, and then I walked out to the street. The cool night air felt refreshing after being in the warm bar, one of the few good things about smoking. I found a spot a little away from the entrance and lit up a cigarette. It was kind of an alley in between the two buildings, and there was a street light not far away. The street was relatively quiet, with only a few people passing by. When I was about halfway done with my smoke, a man walked up to me and started getting in my face. It was that drunk guy from before. He must have kept drinking though, because he was even worse than before. In fact, I thought he might have been on more than booze. The guy was yelling at me for a while, mostly just calling me names and swearing. I didn't take the bait and get into it with him though. I hardly said a word to him. Instead, I just put out my cigarette and started walking back into the bar. But as I passed the man, I felt a sudden sharp pain in my side. Before I could react, I realized that the drunk guy had stabbed me. I saw him standing there next to me, holding a knife. I was feeling woozy, but still tried to get back to my friends. However, before I got away from him, I felt another stab, and then everything went black. It all happened so quickly, and I didn't even have time to shout for help. The next thing I remember was waking up in a hospital bed. I was the only one in the room, and the lights were so bright that they made me squint. It took a minute for me to remember what happened. My side ached, and I could feel bandages wrapped around me. I tried to sit up, but felt a sharp pain and decided against it. I looked around and saw some medical equipment and an IV drip attached to my arm. Then a nurse walked by and noticed that I was awake. She came in to check on me. I told her I was in pain, and she nodded, explaining that I had been brought in with stab wounds and had undergone surgery. She told me I was going to be okay, but it would take time to heal. Later that day, a police officer came in to talk to me. I told him what I remembered and described the man who attacked me. I didn't know it at the time, but they already had the man. Apparently there were some witnesses, and they might have actually saved my life. Over the next few days, I began to recover. The doctors and nurses were great and made sure I was healing properly. My friends visited me a few times and brought me some of my things while I was in bed. As for the attacker, he was charged and convicted for what he did to me. For whatever reason, they took it easy on him and he only got 2 years in prison. I think that's crazy considering what he did. He was a dangerous guy, and it's disturbing to know that he's still out there on the streets. It's been 5 years now, and I've moved to another city, not because of this, but I was definitely happy to say goodbye to anything that would remind me of this experience.